Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Once again, welcome to this course on strategic trade and protectionism, theories and empirics. This is the second lecture, which specifically stretching to the introduction as discussed in the first lecture. The first lecture was purely on India's trade and protectionism, specifically the background to the protectionism issues. Now, we are stretching a bit to understand how protectionism and strategic trade are connected as an introductory part of the total volume. Now, myself Dr. Pratap Mohanty as a faculty in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. I have been covering strategic trade in different training module as well while I was in Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. So, I will talk about many aspects of strategic trade. But for sure strategic trade is not understood correctly unless we emphasize the theory behind it. Without theory, empirics is meaningless. The theory identifies various issues pertaining to various circumstances as observed by different experts. There are a gamut of literature which has understood strategic trade. Now, let me have the privilege to go further to understand the background of strategic trade. Now, especially after World War II, the international competition for manufactured products was actually improved tremendously, especially among the topmost countries. And especially the high growth and high tech economies. So, the focus was after World War II on producing as much as possible on the manufacturing goods. Now, manufacturing goods also created space for the understanding of intra-industry trade instead of inter-industry trade. What is the difference between these two? Intra-industry trade emphasizes the trade within the industry. Instead of understanding X product exchange with X product, we are supposed to understand X within X. So, suppose we are referring to two commodities X and Y, there are two countries A and B. Now, we are supposed to explain two things. If you are explaining X against Y like this is purely called inter-industry trade, Now, if I just go to a go to another slide here, I will explain these things in detail. Now, there are two countries, let us country A and country B, they are in trade with each other. Now, this is the border line by which they transact their products. For commodity X is of one industry and commodity Y for another industry. Now, with the classical instruction to trade or classical suggestions, classical economists and their suggestion to trade, and which suggests that X is exchanged with Y. So, this is purely called inter-industry trade. inter-industry trade. Now, over the time what really happens, due to specialization and due to economies of scale, products are generated with highly differentiated in nature. So, not necessarily products are different in nature, they are differentiated, like FMCG variety, FMCG variety, fast moving consumer goods like detergent, like toothpaste, like even textile products as well, although it is not part of FMCG. So, products are slightly differentiated, they are usually homogeneous in nature. So, the homogeneity comes from not just due to trade, rather it is due to high specialization, high extent of specialization, and this has given space for innovation and technical know-hows being exchanged across the countries. So, the innovation actually gave birth the production which are varying slightly and they make very qualitative products. So, now the question comes, if the products, even if X, the same textile variety, same toothpaste varieties, they are treated as X as the commodity. So, one country export X, in lieu another country is actually is also exporting, the country B also exporting X to the country A. So, it is not just one directional transaction, rather there are two directional transaction. This is one direction, country A export X to B and another half is actually exported by B to A. So, there are both directional transactions, this is called intra-industry trade. Intra-industry trade, and in the present days majority of the products are actually exchanged in this route, in intra-industry transaction routes. So, now this point is clarified to the extent of explaining how trade is taking place, especially after World War II, and this has become the reality only because after World War II many countries have opened up their boundaries, and they have been trying their best to minimize the extent of protections, extent of tariffs, especially tariffs, though non-tariff barriers are rising over the time. We will be explaining in a short while. Now, if I talk about other details, now this intra-industry trade is highly observed in European common market. Now, again there are many concepts to it, European Union as against Union common market, or currency union or trade union. There are various other concepts we will explain in the trade integration or trade blocks unit. But for our idea, this is majorly referred to Eurozones or Eurozones, okay, where many countries are actually connected due to their intra-industry trade setups and intra-industry trade transactions. Now, they use various means such as export subsidies. Now, this is very important to discuss so far as trade strategies is concerned, and export subsidies are the means of making their products more competitive in the international market. The domestic country tries their best to promote their exporters in terms of subsidies in order to bargain in the international market. Now, this is primarily suggested as one of the most important instrument of strategic trade as against optimum tariff only because tariff, if one country tries to impose tariff or to have an optimum tariff for another country's products to divert their market within the country, that has been observed that countries retaliate very quickly. But in case of export subsidies, retaliation has been observed very less, because it creates expenditure to the domestic country as well. So, this is the phenomenon observed for the especially for the developed countries, because they have enough expenditure to be borne for the export subsidies. Now, export subsidies has been seen especially in high tech and high investment and high growth countries, okay? High tech industries, high investment related sectors, and especially in high growth sectors and countries as well. Now, let us understand why we should have a theory on it. What the theory in totality talks about. Broadly, theory conceptualizes various circumstances into a simplified version of understanding to the common people. Now, theory puts various situations into different set of equations or different set of arguments to understand or to project for a near future or for a long future. Now, the classical theories broadly talks about the supply side of the story, that the supply creates its own demand. The classical therefore propagated for as less as possible interventions, and we are referring to the context in the early 18th century or the late 17th century, where those economy were actually driven by supply side of the economy. But over the time, since problems are actually aggravated and there have been shortfall of demand to catch up the supply, so many other economists seriously captured the other issues in the market. Now, in this connection, we are supposed to understand why new theories are important. Over the time, after classicals, I think it is always important, always very important to know that the new classical suggested for not just not just the labor as the factor behind production, or the competitive structure between the industries or the firms that guides the production function. In other words, I just wanted to say that it is not the perfect equilibrium that guides, or not just the perfect market that guides the trade, rather the imperfection in the market actually derives lots of possibility of trade. The imperfections in the market actually derives possibility of trade, which was emphasized by the new trade theory. The classicals broadly confined their direction in the no public policy, no government interventions, supply resources available, and these are optimized in the production function. So, therefore, only one varieties of products are produced and exchanged with another commodities with another country, wherein the new classical suggests that it is not the case. It is not the factor that guides. It is rather, factor labor is not everything, rather more than other than labor are also important, like the availability or the endowment as mentioned by the Hexter-Ohlin model, and also the standard theory talks about some aspects of imperfect competitive structure which led to international trade. And they also suggested to the fact that there is no perfection in the equilibrium. So, there is no question of corner solution. We will discuss in detail in its respective module. Now, European common market as a whole viewed the US as a competitor, and accordingly they strategize very differently. After some time, it was observed that Japan has successfully shifted from developing status to a developed country status. Now, with the success of Japan and international industry competition between the European common market, US needed an explanation from international trade. Let me also point out some other periods which are also important in this connection. Before 1980s, international trade theory did not expect that national competitive advantage would change with the function of private activity or the government policy. So, basically after 1980 is the period where the new classical or the new classical theory, especially the modern trade theories, emphasize the role of government policy. And government policy in strategizing their products, in facilitating their products to make their products more competitive in the international market. Now, why this is the phenomenon? Because usually we have seen in microeconomic theory that there are broadly the markets are divided into two structure, perfect and imperfect. Perfect market has various classy assumptions which are not valid in many contexts, whereas in imperfect competitive structure product differentiations is one of the important features. So, product differentiation actually emerges because of scale economies, and scale economies are the product of many other factors. One of the factor may be government policies which facilitates product differentiation. Now, in this context the mainstream models except even during the mainstream models, basically we are trying to talk about the classical models, except the optimum tariff did not leave enough space for trade policy to promote national welfare. Now, another aspect is also emphasized, how the new trade theory also talks about the implications on national welfare through non-tariff measures or tariff measures. Especially here they talk about subsidies as against optimum tariff, because as I already mentioned, tariff has a chance of retaliation, but whereas subsidy has been observed that subsidy has less retaliation because it incurs cost to the government. Now, if you look at optimum tariff model, as I already mentioned, it might lead to retaliation by other countries. Again, there are unexplained trade phenomenon by traditional trade theory, especially there are cases of game theoretic strategy by different firms, and it is the urgent need of the government to intervene in the international trade, otherwise it might divert trade massively. Now, the first and foremost importance in this context was emphasized by Brander and Spencer in 1985. They talked about strategic trade policy. In many documents are available which identifies STPs, strategic trade policy, on the basis of imperfect competition in the market. Now, it was built as a framework because of monopolistic competition prevailed in the market. Observing international dependency of government policy is very important, because if one government adopts certain kind of policies, so another government must observe that to retaliate it or take the advantage differently. But if I just try to talk about different models, especially let me go quickly to the understanding of Stackelberg model, where we usually emphasize leader follower proposition, leader follower position, where the leader, if leader is the country which adopts a new policy, especially this is discussed in the context of optimum tariff. Once one country adopts optimum tariff, another country will retaliate. So, therefore, ultimately in the long run that leads to reduction of welfare in both the countries. So, usually it has been observed that there has been a price war, price reduced dramatically. though in the initial phases the leader captures the market, but long run it was not sustainable. Whereas at against to this model, Brander Spencer suggested for domestic subsidy, as I already said several times, which make price of the product go down because of subsidy in the international market, but the domestic product profit would actually increase, but the foreign profit decreases because of strategies in the way of giving subsidies to the exporters. Branders and Spencer in their 1985 paper again emphasized domestic firms competed with foreign firms, and market was an oligopolistic structure or even monopolistic structure. Export subsidies could be an effective government instrument. This is similar to the views I have mentioned in the earlier slide. So, therefore, the policy as a strategy now moving towards profit shifting policy, not just trade policy, rather profit seeking policy, profit shifting policy with the intervention of government. Now, in order to have better instrument of strategic trade policy, we may say that there is no such difference between new classical trade theory as compared to the modern or the new classical trade policy. So far as understanding the national welfare is concerned, because both the theory talked about national welfare. If tariff is imposed, how much is the distortion in terms of national welfare will be discussed in our succeeding week of our lecture. But whereas as against the traditional one country can increase its national welfare at the cost of other countries, which has not been discussed in the traditional trade theory. So, basically there is a cut off bargaining, and that emphasize zero sum game, though zero sum game, especially in the mercantilism propositions. In mercantilism school they talked about zero sum game, one is better off at the cost of another one. But in the new class, I mean in the traditional theory, they said that both will actually grow while trade. But in case of modern theory or the new classical theory, they said that there are possibility of again the case of zero sum game. Okay. And now, so therefore, as we have emphasized several times that the importance of public policy is the call for today's monopolistic competition. Now, the development strategy trade policy, development of the strategic trade policy are actually based on various assumptions, strict assumptions. Strategic trade policy are possible if and only if some of these assumptions are followed. Like commitment ability of the government, if the government is very committed towards its citizens or the development of their domestic sector, then there are high possibility of benevolent government and can able to go for having better facilitations. So, another aspect assumption is called asymmetric information. When the information is not correctly diffused to all the countries, so there are possibility of different strategies. Non-linearity in the policy instrument as well, because in the policy instruments are not fixed, they are very often the time overlapping, and even there are various forms of policy instruments. So, therefore, when they are not clearly defined, countries can take advantage out of it. So, these are very realistic assumptions and are very required while having any kind of strategic trade policy. Some other assumptions are like cost of social capital, which suggests that the society as a whole bear the brunt of the taxes, bear the brunt of of the strategic trade policy to some extent. If they retaliate and don't accept the changes, then it will be very problematic. So, there are possibility of negative welfare to their society. So, there are high chances of social capital as well. So, that has to be minimized. So, similarly, uncertainty of demand across the countries and economic disparities of in the participant country and intermediate product if intermediate product are very competitive in nature and does not have imperfections, may not differentiate the product, actually differentiate the final product. Similarly, strategic alliance, they have coalition with some of the partners to minimize their expenditure and to differentiate their product. So, trade blocks are referred in this context highly. So, these are various aspects of strategic trade policy. Now, if you look at in short what is going to be discussed at strategic trade policy and in all other succeeding classes, we are supposed to discuss broadly classical economies, where we will discuss the opportunity cost of production and the comparative cost advantage derived out of it. In the new classical school of explanation for international trade, we will talk about product structure in factor prices, how these determine international trade, product volume, does it matter by scale or by abundance, by intensity, those things will also be covered, factor abundance will be covered. Now, when we talk about these two theories, we will certainly have certain aspects of trade policy based on the availability of resources. So, trade policy will actually talk are very essential for various trade modelings. So, therefore, those classical theories are also important. In addition to that, we are supposed to add mercantilism theory as well, in detail. So, now the major nitty-gritties and the strategic trade are actually discussed in the context of IU, industrial organizations, where we refer to new trade or the new classical trade theories. Imperfection in the trade market, especially oligopolistic structure or monopolistic structure are referred, and where we will be explaining in detail how intra-industry trade is conducted, and majority of the trade in the present days are in the form of intra-industry trade. I have already explained the diagram of intra-industry trade before. Similarly, the new trade theory also emphasize geographic economies, boundaries if you are less, and these economies are actually also important, especially European Union if you are referring to, they have huge economies in terms of their geographic boundaries. And similarly, if you refer to SAARC countries, ASEAN countries, India has attached its benefits to its neighboring countries, and that massively reduces the total expenditure for transportation. And the internal economies are also highly internalized due to the integration of those border economies. Now, similarly, multinationalism or multilateralism with the help of multinationals, new goods, growth and development are also discussed in the context of international trade policies. These are also discussed in the context of economic integration as well. Now, couple of other details to be guided, since this is the introduction, it is always important to understand the whole structure of the other classes, other week lectures. So, we will be discussing theories of international trade in detail. We will emphasize mercantilism, which talks about trade surpluses, a nation can only benefit at the cost of other nation, which I have already said zero sum game is emphasized by the mercantilism. Then we will also discuss cost advantage theory, opportunity cost advantage theory, emphasizing Adam Smith theory to the comparative cost advantage theory by David Ricardo, where we will talk about gains from trade and or gains from specialization. These theories are not emphasizing on the zero sum game aspects. Some other modules will guide us in two directions: partial equilibrium as against general equilibrium analysis. Partial equilibrium analysis, where we will be discussing about demand and supply of the market at a go for a specific product, for a specific industry at a time. Whereas, in the general equilibrium analysis we will emphasize offer curve, where all markets are collected simultaneously, factor market, product market, service market, all markets are connected simultaneously to derive at equilibrium trade prices. How these prices actually strategized across the globe, okay, through these theories. Now, after explaining these two connections, we will also talk about availability of resources called factor intensity and factor in abundance. Factor in abundance with the availability of resources within the country that differ trade, and based on the abundance of the factors, specialization is also expected, though the this theory, Hexter-Ohlin theory did not explain so much on this. They try to only emphasize this abundance and intensity accordingly, but later on some other important results are derived, which led to factor price equalization. Factor price equalization, factor in one country actually equalize with factor in another country. So, W1 wage rate in one country equalize with W2 in another country. Similarly, interest rate are also expected to be equalized. So, strategies of trade is also connected in this context, because when there are trade taking place specially based on factor abundance, the factor prices are also expected to be equalized. So, when factor prices are equalized, the country might tap the benefits out of it. The third country also might derive maximum benefit out of it. Now, whereas Stolper-Samuelson theory, Samuelson received Nobel Prize already on its contribution to many developmental theory, especially in trade theory. It says that factor prices are equalized. That is true. It also equalized across the sectors, not just wage is equalized to wage, wage is also equalized with other sector or interest rate, cost of the capital as well. So, those things also be explained. Now, after having discussed with these new classical theories and classical theories, the modern theories actually emphasize on policy instruments by talking about tariff, as I discussed, where we will be emphasizing again Stolper-Samuelson theory a bit and the different types of tariffs. We also talk about small nation argument versus large argument. For example, if China and Nepal is in trade, then in which context Nepal is going to take benefit out of it, and if China and US is in having trade war, then is it necessarily a fact that US is having win-win situation in all the contexts, then what really undermines US not to take advantages will be explained with the help of theories. So, now the most important emphasis will be given, major emphasis will be given on non-tariff barriers, where we will be discussing export subsidies which are emphasized by Brander and Spencer's model, import quota, voluntary export restraint, other technical barriers to trade, dumping, trade creation, trade diversion through customs union are also be emphasized. Basically, I am referring to blocks, multilateralism and regionalism aspects will also be discussed. So, therefore, India has bilateral trade agreements with all major regional groupings. We have already explained in our previous lecture that India has agreement with 28 forms in the year 2018. So, India has been trying its best to tap all possible strategic trade through various agreements. Now, the progress of those bilateral agreements of India are discussed here in detail. We will carry forward all those details with India EU BTIA, IFTA, SEPTA, preferential trade agreements, then India Nepal treaty. There are actually various forms. ASEAN will discuss in the trade block chapter, because this is the introduction. I just have the glimpse of all those things. Here we will carry forward all those discussion in detail, especially in the trade blocks chapter. Now, having said this, in short, trade strategies are important, not just tariff that as proposed by the new classical economist is important, non-tariff barriers are very important, and strategic trade are also defined by in the present days through differentiated products and through various forms of regionalism and multilateralism. With this, thank you so much. We will carry forward to the next class.